Okay, good evening all. I'm Councillor Sayar Raza, the Chair of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. It's now 7 p.m. and so I'd like to welcome all to this meeting of the committee, members of the committee who are here this evening, guests from NHS and other members who are present, as well as council officers who will be assisting members throughout the meeting. In addition, I would like to welcome members of the public today. We have two substantial issues before the committee: emergency planning and crisis management and learning from the pandemic, and the outcome of Council's special educational needs and disabilities area inspection. We also have three shorter items: an overview of cycle parking provision in the borough, updates from scrutiny panel chairs, and regular review of the work programme and urgent business. It might be helpful to guests and the committee if I set out how the evening's meeting will work. As chair, I'll be running the meeting and inviting people to speak. I would allow every member of the committee who wishes to speak the opportunity to speak. So I would ask members to wait their turn and not interrupt people when they are talking or comment on the contributions of others, except during their own statements. As always, we will treat our guests with courtesy, and whilst the issues before us today are important topics with real-world impact, we will ensure our questions and debates are measured and constructive. We are here to express our opinions on the merits and otherwise the agenda items before us and try to come to a collective view, or failing that, a majority view. I intend to use the following procedure. I shall invite the relevant member, where relevant, the officer, to introduce a report. I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions of that member or officer. I shall then invite members to express their views as part of the debate on the report. I will remind members that I shall give everyone who wishes to speak the chance to do so, but in accordance with the council rules of debate, you will only be allowed to speak once at the discussion stage. If you hear something said by somebody else that you dislike or disagree with, you do not have the right to comment after they have spoken or interrupt them. Please say everything you wish to say in your allocated time, which will be up to 5 minutes each. I, or Councillor Foot, my Vice Chair, shall then speak last and then briefly to sum up the discussion and advise of any issues or common ground to note. We have a great deal to cover this evening, so please be mindful of your fellow committee members and our guests and ensure your contributions are to the point. There will be a little bit of a change, but before that, I'll just start with agenda item number 1, apologies, absence declaration of interest. I do have Councillor Perisotto. Is there any other apologies I'm unaware of? No, thank you. So agenda item number 2. So the committee is to approve the minutes for the meeting held on the 15th of February 2023. Does the committee agree the minutes? Right. Yep, thank you. Okay, so agenda item number 3. So this will be slightly different. So we are looking at the energy planning and crisis management. Declarations of interest? No, thank you. Thank you for that. And then just minutes is agreed. Yeah. Oh,
I wasn't sure if you're just taking declarations from the committee members or.
just the committee members.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the agenda item will be an emergency planning and crisis management. We will then go to item number 5, which is the overview of cycling parking provision. Then we will come back to the outcome of the SEND area inspection. So without further ado, if I can go to item number 3, which is emergency planning and crisis management. There we go. So the first substantial item tonight looks at the lessons the pandemic has taught us with regards to emergency planning and crisis management. The last 3 years have brought emergency planning into limelight, and OSC were keen to understand how these years have helped us understand what has worked well and what could be improved. The appendix provides a detailed overview of local structures and an assessment of the Council's performance against resilience standards for London. It also provides a committee with a timeline for our own COVID evaluation timeline and the opportunities available to the Council to contribute to the UK's public inquiry into COVID-19. You will see that the committee has asked to consider and comment on this report, setting out our general approach to resilience and the framework to understand the lessons learned from the Council response to COVID-19 pandemic. It is proposed evaluation of this response. We are joined by Councillor Rajwat, leader of the Council, whose portfolio also covers emergency planning, Victoria Lawson, the Executive Director for Environment, Culture and Customer Service, in whose directorate the Council's emergency planning function sits, and Holly Gordon. Hello, Holly. Holly Gordon, a member of the Council Emergency Planning team. Thank you all for being here. Councillor Rajwat, you have 5 minutes to introduce your report. Thank you.
Chair, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having us. Between myself and Victoria and Holly, we're sort of going to double hat this, so I'll just say a few words by way of introduction to this. Obviously, you've had the slides, so and thank you very much for doing the introduction, saves me having to do it. So, quite rightly, the committee asked us to come back to talk about the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and our response to it locally, and also how that fits in within the London framework, and then more nationally in terms of the national inquiry, which we will cover. I think by way of introduction, I think I would say that emergency planning, even prior to the pandemic, was firmly embedded within the organisation. I think that's really, really important. And within that, there's certainly to my mind, always been a clear understanding of the strategic goals of emergency planning and resilience, the operational roles and responsibilities that sit within that, as well as how members fit into that whole overall structure as well. And in my view, that's worked very well in this last year. And we, Victoria will cover some of the context with the number of instances that we've had where the emergency and resilience team have had to be stepped up to deal with various different things, even post-pandemic as well. I can also report a bit of good news in terms of the way we've embedded it in Hounslow is considered best practice, and it is being used as a case study across, especially in terms of the way members fit into the overall structure as well. And there is a report going through the LGA at the moment on civil contingencies and resilience, where we've been asked to provide a case study on how we involve members in that process as well. So it's just a brief introduction from me. If you don't mind, Chair, I'll hand over to Victoria for the meat.
Would you just like me to do a brief introduction, Chair? Because I know I'll just assume the committee have read the slides.
Yes, just the bullet points, that'd be great, thank you.
Absolutely. So what we've been able to do in the slides for Overview and Scrutiny Committee is just to outline the timeline of events and the varied nature of resilience and emergencies that we've experienced as a council and as a borough. I think that's really important to understand, and we're expecting that to continue to an extent, particularly as we see increased risk from areas such as climate, which is putting pressure on seasonality around drought, heat waves, wildfires, winter planning and the like. And so that's the first sort of set of slides. We've spent a bit of time for the committee just outlining what our Hounslow resilience arrangements are, what our responsibilities are, and our emergency response structures and roles, which hopefully the committee will find useful in terms of how we respond. It's also important to identify that for Hounslow, like all Category 1 responders, we've also got our Hounslow Resilience Forum, which is about how we work locally at a multi-agency level, which is really important if you think about the diversity tend to be the first responders. So there's quite a bit of detail in there about that multi-agency working. We've also outlined some of the training that we've done with elected members and the role of elected members, and as a committee you might have a view on that and where we might be able to continue to work and improve. The key thing, and it's different in London than it might be elsewhere is that we have resilience standards that are applied to London. So all London boroughs benchmark themselves against the 11 resilience standards. And we've outlined our approach to understanding and improving against those resilience standards. And we've put in our position for 2020 and our current draft, highlight draft position for 2023. And then finally, we've outlined our approach to our COVID evaluation and the timeline for that, and given OSC, the committee, some information into the national COVID-19 public inquiry, what that frame is looking like, and an initial response that went out to all local authorities around the public inquiry, and how we are now readying ourselves for any inquiries that we may get, probably through the LGA, who are representing the local government family. And that's just a quick summary and highlight of the slides, Chair.
Thank you for that. Okay, so now we will go to the questions of the report. So if I can just start with the first question, it's just because it's there. So, so here we go. So what has been learnt so far from COVID and other emergencies, and how can we implement and respond to emergencies more quickly as a consequence?
So I think there are a number of things that we've learned through COVID. So actually, I think we've tested the robustness of some of our emergency planning structures within our own organisation. So our gold, silver capacity. And one of the things, for example, that we've implemented is that all chief officers are now on a gold rota, for example, to give capacity and understanding around our response. I think the other thing that we've begun to learn and recognise is that we're facing chronic pressures continually, and they vary throughout the year, but that seems to be something that we're facing, and we're not any different to any other local authority in that. And as I alluded to in my introduction around flooding, drought, heat, cold, winter, there's a perpetual cycle, I think, of where we need to be ready as an organisation. And I think the resilience standards for London also demonstrate where we were, what we're learning, and what we're doing to move forward. And because we do a self-assessment against that, we're able to continually learn and improve. And there have been examples where we've been able to move from developing to established, or established to advanced, and those standards are very comprehensive. I think it's also about understanding how we can remain fleet of foot, because actually there's ever-changing sort of risk environment that we are in, and it's important to note, I think, that resilience is a part of our corporate risk register, and we also have a community risk register that we discuss at the Hounslow Resilience Forum. I think what we've been able to build in through COVID and others is this sort of culture of readiness and flexibility within the organisation, and I feel when we've been presented with significant challenges and emergencies as an organisation, we've been able to adapt and respond very quickly. The Afghan evacuee crisis is one, Homes for Ukraine is probably another, and actually we even used our gold structures for the death of Her Majesty the Queen.
Thank you for that. Councillor Tapp, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question somewhat replicates what you already asked, but I'm still going to go ahead and ask it. God forbid if we are faced with something similar to a pandemic situation, how well prepared are we to respond to such emergency, and how much time will it take to set up something to take first actions?
I'll start. So, in many respects, COVID changed the climate, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and literally overnight we had to put in structures. So, I think for me, having an emergency planning and resilience team in place in situ is of great benefit. Having the control centre within the borough and within the council is really, really important. So actually, part of that is responding as challenges come up, but as Victoria kind of alluded to, some of that work that the contingency team do is looking at things like climate, things that are sort of burning in the background at the moment that could become crisis later on. So, for example, flooding is a key one. Drought. Yes, again, the drought was something that perhaps caught everyone a little bit by surprise, but it was a lesson in terms of the fact that we know that summers are getting hotter. And so actually from that point, you can start thinking about it and preparing for it. I think it's also a case of working with partners as well. So we work very closely with Thames Water and the statutory services in the Resilience Forum, but also outside of that to leverage funding as well, if we can, to support some of the activity that happens. And we're considered a trusted partner. And obviously, some of that work that we did was recognised as part of the Council of the Year recognition as well. So I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so if there was something similar to the pandemic, your question was how quickly could we respond? I would say almost immediately. The reason for that is we are well prepared and well rehearsed. So one of the advantages of the work that we've been doing across London over the years is the standardisation around our plans. So obviously we've got our major emergency plan. We had our flu pandemic influenza plan, and there's a range of standard plans that mean we can come together. No emergency is standard, so that's the point about culture around flexibility and adaptability. But I think we've got clear arrangements in place. We'd be able to mobilise our organisation, and why I can say we're well rehearsed is we understand where we have our strengths as identified through the resilience standards for London. We understand where we need to continue to improve, but also through the team, through colleagues such as Holly, we're well trained and we're exercised, and those in key roles understand their role that we need to take forward. So I think that would be my answer to that question, Councillor.
Thank you. Councillor Kiani, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got twofold questions, if I may. Post-COVID, how we measure our success, and how confident we are that the next iteration of RSL position will see further improvements.
Sorry, Councillor, could you just repeat those questions for me? I caught the last one, but not the first one.
Sorry. How confident are we that the next iteration of the RSL position will see further improvement? That's the second fold.
So in the slides, we've shown where our position was in 2020 and where we're about to be in 2023. They're still draft because we're having conversations right across the organisation. You'll have seen some of them have moved, and we remain confident that that will continue to be an area of continual improvements. There are areas, I think, particularly around community resilience, where we continue to develop and learn from others. One of the things that we do to understand our confidence around RSLs is we will do a sub-regional workshop, and the one for West London is planned for the end of this month, so the 31st of March, and we will benchmark ourselves against our 8 boroughs in West London, and we'll understand where they may be doing things better than we are, and we'll share good practice about where we see ourselves on those respective RSLs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I can just take a question from Councillor Bowring, please.
Thank you, Chair. We know that third sector groups, both established and impromptu, played a vital role in supporting the vulnerable plug-in gaps and gathering information on the ground, particularly in seldom heard communities. What consideration has been given to how this asset could be supported and leveraged in the future in a balanced way that doesn't discourage or frustrate charities, volunteers, and grassroots support groups?
So it's a fantastic question. Thank you, Councillor Barry. So I'll start, and Victoria can talk specifically in terms of resilience. But I think a lot of this comes back to the approach the council is taking, and understanding that actually, absolutely, as you said, those voluntary groups, especially with seldom heard communities, played such a key role during the pandemic. And that informed a lot of the work that we're doing around community solutions and around our community-based approach. So actually bringing council services into localities is really, really important, and supporting the voluntary sector either through funding or through support through our officers, and the investment we've just put in through the budget into that approach, I think will pay dividends, because it gives them that confidence to ask questions about how they can play a role. So God forbid we have another influenza type crisis. Actually, what I'd like to see is not them coming to us, but us naturally seeing them as partners and going, actually, this is how you can support us, and you know how we can support you in achieving those aims as well. So,
Yeah, so just to build on the leader's point about how they play their role. So we've had some really good examples through the COVID pandemic around our engagement with Friends of Faith groups, the work that we did with the mosque and the Gurdwara around vaccinations. We've also done a lot around community champions. I think that there's an important part, isn't there, to understand around voluntary and community sector feeling like they can just respond in the way that they need to, but how we coordinate that energy and effort, and how we can use each other to really get into those different communities. And I think that was really exemplified through the pandemic, through the work of the community engagement that was undertaken, the work of the community solutions team and the public health team, really working with those different voluntary and community sector groups. There's also a role for voluntary community sector in the Household Resilience Forum, and also the fact that we rely on emergency volunteers, and they come from within our own communities. And again, we often try to encourage participation around emergency volunteers. So maybe that's a plug we can come back to for councillors to really help us try and build that capacity. And again, we saw that through the Afghan evacuee crisis, and the role of the voluntary and community sector, again, coming to the fore to help respond to some of the challenges that that particular community were facing as they arrived into Hounslow.
Councillor Tuck, please.
Thank you, Chair. I looked at the resilience standards for London, and the standards in 2020 and 2023 for capabilities, plan and procedure is static. We haven't improved. You said about capabilities, plans and procedures that we have put a lot of things in place, but in terms of standards, we are still where we were in 2020. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Councillor. So one of the reasons for that is the work of the resilience team was predominantly focused on the COVID response and our recovery from COVID. And therefore, one of the things that we do need to do and are continuing to do is update the plans and the work plan that we had in place, that we had to, how do I put it politely? Other things took precedence. So it's about catching up. So we've been able to start to do that, and we've got a really clear set of priorities that we want to deliver over the next few years. We're also very conscious we want to take the learning from COVID and use it to update our major emergency plan, and so we're conscious about being very honest and transparent about where we are. So yes, have we improved in certain areas around our capability? Absolutely, we have. Other areas where we now need to catch up with ourselves because our focus was on the COVID response and recovery, which is the right place for it to be. Yes, we do. So some things have moved forward and some things need to move forward.
Councillor Biddulph, please.
Thank you, Chair. It was very good to read this report and be reminded of the many crises that happened throughout this time and all the hard work that an awful lot of people have put in and are, I expect, still exhausted by, because I know some of us are still exhausted. So thank you very much for that. Indeed, and I know it's still continuing. It's not over. I haven't got rid of COVID. I've just had it for the third time, so I can prove that for you, despite having had all the jabs. I would like to raise a couple of queries. I accept that the plans are embedded in the administration, but they're not embedded with councillors. And that came out in the pandemic. We'd had one, I raised it first of all, and my background is in crisis management. And I raised it, I remember, at a very early meeting which Victoria was taking when we were new in 2018. And that we hadn't had any crisis training as councillors, and we really needed it, whether it's a small level in our wards, what do you do if there's a local fire, etc., or if it's something like this. And I think that's still not been achieved. We've had one workshop, we were promised another one, pandemic hit. Obviously, we accept that, but I do think we need as councillors to have more resilience, crisis management training. And part of that must include the fact that in a crisis, all councillors are equal and of equal value and should be being asked to contribute in equal ways, because there were quite clearly things happening that opposition councillors were not being invited to take part in
Councillor,
and not being
please
informed.
ask the question.
So could that please be built into the crisis management plan that's being amended? My points are about amending the crisis management plan. I've said this in a meeting that we had, a pre-meeting. I find that mitigation is wrongly described in here. Mitigation is usually to spot risks and try to avoid them rather than to review. So I think that needs some massaging in the way it's presented. And in terms of, so please could you do that, since it has to be a question, and build in the review. Again, I still don't feel that councillors were asked to feed back in enough detail. And I know this was brushed out of the way by the previous leader. I hope this leader might be more amenable to hearing from us.
Can we have the question, please?
Could there
Councillor
please
Biddulph?
be a really detailed questionnaire so we can, some of the nitpicking stuff really does have to come out. And we've only been asked broad brush questions. And I think we can contribute, having learned an awful lot from what we did. So can that be built in, please? I've got some other points, but I'll leave them till later.
Thank you, Councillor Biddulph. If I can have Councillor Cameron, please.
Am I allowed an answer to the questions? No?
What was the question, Councillor?
I had about three, I think. Victoria was writing them down.
Yeah.
I can, so embedding into the wider emergency plan, the training for councillors, yes. So obviously we did training in 2019, and we did obviously further member induction. But I take your point, Councillor Biddulph, about that. We can make amendments to the major emergency plan. Happy to come back to OSC to share the major emergency plan once we've been through the COVID evaluation. We'll take your points about mitigation. We'll look at the wording of that. And obviously the evaluation for COVID-19 is about to start. So happy to take any feedback as you've provided tonight on the role of councillors in that engagement. Leader.
Can I just comment on that last part, please? Because it's rather than happy to take, it's could you please ask? Yeah, thank you.
So, Councillor Biddulph, in my mind, I'm very clear, and I'm afraid I don't recognise your view that not all councillors were equal in the COVID response. If someone said something, it was listened to. So I don't recognise that characterisation of that. I think some of this comes back to a very clear understanding of roles and responsibilities. And whilst I'm absolutely appreciative of the local knowledge that ward councillors hold and can provide, and I accept that fully, we need to be careful that where we've got a structure in place which delegates the operational side of things to officers who are quite rightly placed to be able to deal with them, taking on feedback should not become the operational prerogative. Understanding what councillors are saying in their local context, absolutely important, but we have to keep that clear distinction between what is operational and what is your local knowledge and your lived knowledge as well.
Sorry, Chair, that wasn't my point. That's completely twisting my words. That's not what I'm saying at all. There were opportunities. Councillors were invited to do things. They were asked by the administration, but not all councillors were invited to do things. That's my point on that point. You didn't experience it, so that's why you're unaware of it, but certainly we did. And just one final point on that, in terms of seeking, I'm sorry that you find it something to mock, Chair, but I find it, you must accept that that is what
I need to ask the questions. We need to ask questions. We can't just talk about statements of what did or what didn't happen. So if we can ask questions.
Well, it's important to contradict things that aren't true. I don't want, to, anyway, I know you don't appreciate contributions from me.
No, not at all, Councillor Biddulph. That's totally incorrect. I do appreciate that there's still a lot to do on this report. The report doesn't finalise until June 23, if I'm correct. So a lot of what you're bringing up, I'm sure that would be within the valuation by that time, and I'm sure this will come back to OSC anyway. But we do need to kind of move on. So there is one question from me regards to residents. So how prepared are residents when it comes to emergencies?
It's an interesting question. In many respects, our role is because many residents wouldn't necessarily appreciate emergency situations. So there's that piece around reassurance and knowing where to go should there be a situation where they need support, be it on a small local level or big influenza type crises. So I would probably accept that whilst we've got our internal work on resilience, some of that is normalising that with residents so that they know where to go in the council when there is an emergency, so that they know that there is support there and there are structures in there to support them. I think that would be.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's some very specific things that we do for residents who might be at slightly higher risk. So if we use flooding, for an example, so we've been doing a lot of work across London about making the connections with the right partners to improve communication around flooding resilience. Obviously for London in July 2021, there were some serious surface water flooding, and I think that highlighted for London, not necessarily for Hounslow, but for London, the importance of that communication, and again trying to build residents' awareness where they may be at risk of things like that, about what they need to do as well as what we might need to do as the local authority or Blue Lights. And again, we've done a lot of awareness and comms around heat, winter, seasonal planning, but I think it's difficult to make residents prepared for every eventuality, and I think that's why we're here as a local authority, and the Blue Lights, because we'll take a lead in that. But there is more that we can do to increase residents' awareness, and it's an ongoing task for us to do that, Chair.
No, thank you for that, Victoria. Councillor Biddulph, please.
And thank you. Just a couple of small points, picking up on something that Councillor Byring raised about the voluntary sector. We were very good working with existing organisations. There was a real reluctance to work with the community groups that set themselves up around the country, all calling themselves the same thing, and I've forgotten completely what they were called. Friends of, I'm going to get it wrong. And there was a very quick sudden rush of volunteering for them. One group in Chiswick, for example, had 1,000 members and they wanted to deliver food or cook or whatever it happens to be. We were very slow. In fact, I don't think we did ever recognise them because of the cautionary approach. Are they DBS cleared and those sorts of things? I think we need to be a bit faster. Is there something built into the plan that could help us accept these huge offers of help that people feel so compelled to make, understandably? And the only other thing is, if you're seeking feedback still, an awful lot of councillors weren't councillors during the pandemic, and I hope you might ask former councillors to feed in as well.
Thanks, Councillor Biddulph. Yes, we can take on board the point around the voluntary and community sector. I think that's why for the resilience standards, they've got community resilience in there as a particular standard. It is difficult, depending on the type of emergency, to think about what is the right engagement and the right approach with volunteers. I think there was a lot of learning from the Grenfell Towers experience and the way the community mobilised, but also the amount of volunteers and how we manage that demand if it's a very serious incident, around donations, volunteering time. And I think that really highlighted a lot of learning for all London boroughs and probably boroughs up and down the country about how you respond in those particular circumstances. So I think it's a point well made and one we continue to try to work against. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kiani, please.
Thank you, Chair. My next question is, do we have sufficient resources in terms of people and pounds and in our emergency planning capability?
Yes, we do. So we've got our resilience and contingency team, small but beautifully formed. But also what we do rely upon is the work and role of chief officers to act as gold. our heads of service to act in a silver capacity and other colleagues to take on additional responsibilities around rest centres, LALOs, etc. It's always an ongoing activity to make sure that we feel that we've got the right numbers. It's why it's a resilience standard for London. I think there's always work to do in that space, always work to do to make sure we've got enough emergency response volunteers as well. But I think we're well placed, but it's an ongoing task that we need to undertake as a team and as an organisation to make sure we're well resourced. And I think we do that well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the team are constantly scanning the horizon for where there are funding opportunities. So, flooding came up. So, SUDS, which is surface, urban drainage. We're working very closely with Thames Water, and we've been able to secure funding there. So, where there are funding opportunities, I think the council is seen as a trusted partner, and the private sector is very happy to work with us in terms of their obligations as well to mitigate against emergencies, and they're willing to work in partnership with us, and the funding that flows from that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Bowring, please.
Whilst our response was commendable, and literally, and I've got the Council of the Year mark here, and that's a huge part of it. I think one thing I'd like to know is what was the area of greatest shortfall, or if you prefer, what was the area where we learned the most about how we would do things differently?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things that I would say that we learned was how flexible and adaptable we could be as an organisation, how quickly we could mobilise when we absolutely needed to. I think one of the things that local government has fed back more broadly is some of the we had a lot of challenging lead-in times for a number of activities that we were required to undertake. So, some significant commendable activity from parts of the organisation to put in our community hub, our food distribution, and I know a number of councillors helped with that food distribution, how we were to ensure residents had their medication, lots of things that local government had never taken responsibility for. So I think that is one of the key things that we learn, is that actually when we really need to, can we step up and stand up for our residents and our communities? Yes, absolutely we can. And I think we did extremely well to do that under very significant and at that time quite scary circumstances for a lot of our residents, particularly those that were considered clinically extremely vulnerable. And it's interesting, as time passes, that you sort of forget that how scary and fearful that time was. I think that was our biggest piece of learning, that when pushed, absolutely we can stand up and be counted for and count for our residents.
Councillor Tutt, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm taking us back to the resilience standards again. The recovery management, it was assessed as established again 3 years ago and still the same. And one more thing is this only about the council services and operations, or it includes supporting our businesses and our communities as well?
Hi, yes. So for the first question, the recovery management's kind of stayed the same, just because obviously we've been in response phase for the last 3 years. So it's been we've done a lot of recovery work, but I think, like Victoria said earlier, getting that down formally in plans is still in progress, and that's still to be reviewed with the evaluation work that's going on as well. And then what was your second question? Sorry.
Communities and businesses.
Yes. So the businesses part, we do business continuity planning, obviously within the organisation, but I think there's still more that we can do in terms of engaging businesses locally as well. And again, that's part of the improvements that we're making with the business continuity side of things as well.
Thank you for that. So that's all the question. Councillor Biddulph. Oh, right, there's more now. Okay, Councillor Biddulph, please. Okay.
Sorry, I hadn't realised that there was a list as well. I'm very sorry, I've come from another meeting and not been able to catch up. So a series of questions really about feedback. I've sort of touched on it, but one important area is businesses for whom there was a whole new operation, lockdowns, opening partially, social distancing, grants applications. And I think we need to take feedback from businesses about how they experience that. Some councillors did an awful lot more work than others to engage them with getting in touch with your grants, etc. So could we please talk to them? And also in terms of document, is that one of the points? And also residents, I do think we need to go to them, particularly concerned about parents with children with special educational needs who I think didn't fare as well as they might in a future pandemic if we're honest about reviewing how it went. So I think a particular focus on them and how they struggled or didn't struggle. I think they did struggle. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Bizzolf. And I'll bring in Stephen on the latter point, but in terms of who we will speak to as part of our, I guess, structured debrief around COVID evaluation, when we took the paper to Cabinet, it does specifically mention local business community groups and our residents, so that will be picked up as part of that. But thank you. Stephen?
So, Chair, just to respond to Councillor Biddlesworth, I think you're right. I mean, children with special educational needs, it was a scary time. It was a scary time for all parents in the early days until the science got to a position to understand, transmission. I recall early conversations about schools being hotbeds of transmission and children being hotspots of transmission. I think in terms of saying, those schools were open because those children were deemed as vulnerable. We had hesitancy, I think that's fair, on many parents about sending children, particularly those with very complex health needs. So I think there is a bit about what, in any kind of scenario where there is a condition, a transmissible disease, what assurance can parents have? There is a reality that you can't give absolute assurance. And ultimately it came down to many decisions by individual parents as to whether or not they would send their child to school. And we saw, I think, not unique to Hounslow, across many local authorities, a hesitancy for parents to return children to schooling. We saw in particular children being taken out and electively home educated, and that has not recovered from the pandemic. Our numbers still remain high, and that's common across local authorities as well. So there was hesitancy, there was a lack of clarity sometimes in the early days about transmission, parents concerned about children with very complex needs getting access to vaccination. As you recall from the national process, those children were in essence at the end of the queue. So I think all of that is learning at a national level about how we deal with what are inherently vulnerable children anyway, and a huge amount of parental concern.
Could we also look at parents whose children didn't have anywhere to go? And I don't know the circumstances, but they weren't, I think, in school perhaps, because there were such complex needs. I don't know, but there were some parents whose children had to be at home, and their parent, single parent in one case, was working and couldn't work while the parent. Nope. Okay.
Nope.
Okay.
All vulnerable children with special educational needs, looked after children,
Okay.
social worker allocations,
Okay.
had a school place. Whether or not parents felt it was right for their child is a parental decision.
Yeah.
So across those groups, it fluctuated in terms of participation attendance between about 20-odd%. I think the best we got from recollection, and I will check the figure because it's some time since I looked at the figure, was somewhere in the region of about 40-something%. And we were doing pretty well in Hounslow in terms of attendance in comparison to some other areas. So, but ultimately it came down to whether or not children were parents felt confident. We did, however, have some, and Anita's just reminded me, we had some colleagues from Ofsted redeploy to us because they suspended the Ofsted regime throughout the early stage of the pandemic. And we specifically deployed those 3 Ofsted colleagues to look at vulnerable children, their attendance and their support. And we asked them to take an inspection view of that. And I can share that report. I think we did share it at some point. They were very clear that we did what we could do to support those vulnerable children either in school or out school. And they felt from a potential inspection view that we had done what we needed to do. It didn't necessarily mean that children still went to school, but we had line of sight of vulnerable children, home contact or at school.
Thank you. Councillor Sharma, please.
What are we doing to support those SEND children from year 11 onwards? Well, I don't know. Why I don't-
Okay, Councillor Kiani, please. This is a different question, I think. Councillor Cameron. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, do we have a plan for capturing and reporting the value of voluntary hours and donated resources? How could this community capacity be deployed in the future? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. It given me pause for thought. So, my instant reaction is yes, we probably should. I just need to give some thought as to how we actually do that in a meaningful way. So, if you don't mind, Councillor Cameron, good question. Leave it with us if you don't mind.
Councillor Kiani. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. It's not a question, it's just a comment from me. We did very well, I believe, in pandemic, and we are on the track, right track for any future emergencies in terms of our planning.
Yep, thank you all. Okay, so that's all the sort of questions. We're just pressing for time. I do want to move in the discussion stage with all the committee members. So may I just remind you that everyone who wishes to speak have a chance to do so, but please be mindful of fellow scrutineers and do not dominate the discussion. So anything anybody wants to talk about? Councillor Tuck.
Thank you, Chair. I do know that our priorities changed and we had to move to deliver things instead of doing some administration work. So once that is done, can we expect the updated standards to be made available?
Yes, of course, Councillor, we'd be happy to do that. So with the resilience standards for London, which are draft for 2023, we're currently having conversations with within the organisation, and we'll have our sub-regional peer assessment that I mentioned and benchmarking. And so thereafter, we'll be able to formalise that, because what we'll do, along with all of the other London boroughs, is submit that into what's called LAP, and then we'll be able to see what the overall London position is around resilience. I think the other thing I forgot to mention is it's important to know that there are also London resilience arrangements. So should there be a incident of significant scale that impacts several boroughs or London as a whole, I think the most recent that I can bring to mind, aside from COVID, would have been the riots in 2011. Yeah. Where London Local Authority Gold is initiated. So the chief exec for each council is on a 2-week rota to make sure that there's a representative for local authority or local government should London Local Authority Gold be enacted. Sorry, the last time it was before COVID was for Grenfell, and then the riots. So of that scale. Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you all, scrutineers. So I'm just going to pass over to Councillor Foote to summarise the discussion and propose a motion.
Thank you, Chair. Right, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is asked to consider and comment on this report, setting out our general approach to resilience and the framework to understand the lessons learnt from the Council's response to COVID-19 pandemic and its proposed evaluation of this response. I believe that we have covered these points adequately. I therefore move acceptance of the report.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Councillor. Okay, just moving on to agenda item number 4 now. So this is the overview of cycle parking provision. When we met in summer to agree our work programme, members were keen to see what was being done. Sorry. Oh. Hi, sorry. Yeah, Holly can leave. My apologies, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Holly.
When we met in summer to agree our work programme, members were keen to see what was being done to help people cycle. A key element of this was parking, particularly for those residents who lacked space in their own homes. We are joined this evening with Councillor Catherine Dunn, Deputy Leader of the Council and Cabinet Member for Climate, Environment and Transport Strategy, Victoria Lawson. Thank you for providing an overview setting out what has been achieved, the wider context of future plans. Members will see that OSC is asked to note the progress made to date in developing and delivering the Council's cycle parking programme. Note the future improvements that are planned and provide feedback on these plans. This is a shorter, sharper piece of scrutiny. We won't go through the usual process of questions and discussion, focusing instead on any questions the committee might have regarding cycle parking provision. Councillor Dunn and Victoria, Councillor Dunn and Victoria on hand to answer any questions you might have. Remember, this is a short item, and so please ensure your questions are pertinent and focused. Councillor Dunn, would you like to introduce the item? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we were asked to provide information about cycle parking in the borough and our approach to that as a council. We're very keen to improve and increase the amount of cycle parking in the borough because we know that poor access to cycle parking is a barrier to people taking up cycling. Obviously, it's in line with our health, transport, climate strategies for more people to take up cycling. And so we want to enable them to do that. So we have provision in our transport strategy and the local implementation plan to implement cycle parking. We hope that by increasing in an intelligent way the amount for cycle parking in the borough, we can not only increase the number of people using cycling for more of their trips, but also to expand the diversity of the people who are using cycling regularly in the borough. There is somewhat of a disparity at the moment. We know that most cycle trips take place in the east of the borough, and we're keen to address that to ensure that people in the west are equally as enabled to do trips by cycling, and that obviously includes cycle parking as well. We want to make sure that cycle parking caters to everyone who cycles, not just those who use normal bikes, as you might call them, but for people using cargo bikes, for people with disabilities using adapted bikes, hand cycles, etc. And so we have to take that into account with our cycle parking as well. So just to cover the main areas. So firstly, in terms of residential cycle parking, what we know is that people want a secure place to keep their bike, especially overnight when they're at home. Some people are lucky enough to have places like this, whether it's behind a locked gate, whether they have space in their home for a bike, and sometimes things like folding bikes can be helpful there, or whether they have a garage or somewhere locked away. But a lot of people in the borough don't have that. And so that's one of the things that we need to address. We have a programme for cycle hangers. So these are the curved metal structures that you will see on some streets. Each cycle hanger takes up the space of about half a car parking space on the carriageway, and can contain 6 bicycles, 6 standard bicycles. Obviously, if you're looking outside the standard, then it would probably be fewer than that. We have 13 currently in place in the borough, and we have just signed off on 10 more being rolled out, and those have been in response to demand from residents. And we obviously we consult on where those go and so on. But it is a sort of demand-led scheme at the moment. In terms of funding for subsequent rollouts, we hope to be able to achieve similar numbers in the coming years. But that obviously is dependent on our funding from Transport for London, which we get on an annual basis. We are looking at other sources of potential funding for that as well, but our main source of funding for cycle parking is from Transport for London. So it currently costs capital costs of £4,500 per hangar, and costs £72 per space to maintain on an annual basis. We charge the resident £36, so the council is providing a 50% subsidy there. Obviously, as the numbers increase, we will be providing more subsidy, and so that's something that we have to factor into our costs. In terms of our own council estates, we're also looking at providing secure cycle parking there, and that would be at no cost to the residents. Then looking at visitor cycle parking, so this is when you've gone somewhere and you want to leave your bike at the shops, for example. I mean, we would encourage places that want to attract visitors to provide secure cycle parking on their own, but very often you are left to, you need to leave your bicycle outside on the street. And so the most common kind of parking there is the Sheffield stand, which is the hoops that people attach their bicycles to. And so obviously there's a larger amount of this in our town centres, but we need to make sure that extends into residential areas and other places that people want to go as well. So we currently have planned an audit to understand the need for visitor parking across the borough. Again, this will be we will use LIP funding from TfL to implement more cycle parking, but also supplemented by Section 106, especially in town centres. And then looking at places like train stations, we're working with South Western Railways on where that can be improved and built on. We're working with schools, so developing a school travel strategy, and we prioritize funding for schools that are working on the STARS accreditation programme, which encourages active travel to and from school. And we have seen good results there. Thank you. And then finally, so in the paper, you'll see there's a section on e-bike rental. So people will know that there are e-bikes operating in the borough. There's a rental scheme. This is not a scheme that has an agreement with the London Borough of Hounslow or a memorandum of understanding. But Lime does operate an unauthorised scheme within the borough. I say unauthorised, we don't have that agreement with them, but it's perfectly legal. However, if we were to enter into a proper agreement and have an MOU, and that could be with Lime or other e-bike schemes, then we could have much more control as a council, and have a greater role in shaping how the scheme operates, and that could include dedicated bike parking spaces, so that we don't get this problem of them just being left kind of willy-nilly across the borough.
That's great. Thank you for the report. I mean, it's all in favour for me. I do like a bit of biking. A little bit of health would be nice for everybody. So it is really, really encouraging. The only question for me is really, sorry, we now do go to the questions, but the question for me is cycle storage, the actual provision. Is this going to be a part of future planning policies?
Yes. So what I should have said there. So this is all on what I was describing was on public land and on private. On our council housing estates, and then with some of our partners like schools. But yes, on new developments, then we do through the planning. There's now when someone comes to get planning permission for a new development, there is a requirement for them to have a certain level of cycle parking. I think what we need to look at is making sure that that is proper, secure cycle parking of the type that people want. And because people do get worried about leaving the bike locked up outside overnight as opposed to in a secure unit.
Brilliant, thank you. If I can go, yeah, there's quite a lot here. So if I could just start with Councillor Bowring, please.
Chair, I've got a couple of questions, but I'm mindful of time. And shall I ask one question, then come back to me with the others? Is that the best way to do it?
The best question, or the one that's really biting you, do go ahead with that question.
Which one do I choose? I'd like to talk about factoring in delivery drivers. So cycle parking in certain locations across the borough is very oversubscribed due to food delivery cycles at peak times. Hounslow Centre, McDonald's is one example. I would find it impossible to park my bike there if I went there on a regular basis. But at the same time, I'm not painting those guys as bad. So I think my question is, how can we have both the infrastructure that allows delivery operatives to use zero emission vehicles rather than say mopeds, but ensure there's sort of still room for an average user to park their bike in these locations? How are we factoring that demand in, and how are we seeing both interests of both groups met?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think we'll take that one away and make sure that it is factored in. I mean, yes, the delivery drivers of whatever type of vehicle they drive can cause issues when they're waiting outside, basically when they're waiting to pick up. So I think we need to talk to the retailers as well on that. But I know Victoria wants to come in. So.
Yeah, so one of the things that we want to do, Councillor, is an audit of the visitor cycling parking provision to understand where that demand is and what that looks like, and then how we could use that to not just only share where visitor cycling parking is available. So if you're coming in and round the borough where that's available for you, we'll also be able to consider that in terms of demand. So it gives us an ability to be more proactive rather than reactive to the demand that we're seeing from residents.
Chair, can I do a really quick point of explanation?
Yeah, go.
So I think the key thing, I mean, I'm sure this would be covered in any analysis you did, but the key thing is those sort of peak hours when people are ordering food, I think.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Foot, please.
Thanks, Chair. You don't normally hear me talk about the Hamworth and what the things that we have got, but actually we've had on the Butts Farm estate, we've had for quite some time storage for bicycles. That's the good news, and it's actually a Richmond estate which is lodged in Hamworth, but I can say that. But I do think that when we come to consider the provision of units for storage bicycles, we appreciate that wards like Hamworth, which are right on the periphery of the London Borough of Hounslow, that we consider that this is an area where certainly, I mean, there are cycle routes all the way from Hamworth to Hounslow, but at the moment, I don't see them being overutilised, and I think that we could make more use of them if we were doing something along the storage.
Thanks, Councillor Foot. That's really helpful, and it ties into what I was saying earlier about wanting to make sure that we're getting that balance right across the borough and seeking to encourage communities and enable communities who aren't so much involved in cycling at the moment to be able to do that.
Councillor Bidoff, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've got an awful lot of bike parking in Chiswick, which is terrific. And I think we've probably got more than our fair share of the bike hangers, because we seem to sign them off quite often and perhaps fine tune where they should go. And they are very important, of course. I'm concerned about taking up, of course, you'll expect me to say there's parking space for hangers in areas that are important for shopping, because there is no doubt that I know the borough doesn't like cars, but there is no doubt that parking cars helps trade. So it seems to me that we've got a nice spread of bike parking. We might not have enough of it, but I think some caution. Let's do an audit of when it should take over a parking space rather than be provided. For example, at some of our tube stations, which are near shop hubs and need more bike parking.
Yeah, completely agree. We need to check. We need to make sure what the right balance is. I mean, the hangars would typically be more in residential areas where people are storing bikes overnight. They're not, because you need a key for the hangar, and that would only go to a limited number of people. So that it's not designed for visitor parking or short stay parking. So it wouldn't. I mean, obviously, we know that we do have areas that kind of cross over between residential and commercial and town centres. So we just need to look carefully at those areas.
Every road in Chiswick is a residential and shopping road is a residential road in Chiswick. So it is a dilemma.
Councillor Kiani, please.
Thank you, Chair. We are seeing that more cyclists are on the road. But my question is that what cycling proficiency standard or training is being provided? Is that enough? And do you think more could be done to promote safe cycling?
Did you want to take that one, Victoria?
Yeah, thanks. So we do offer quite a lot of cycle training, and I think that's got a good take up. But I think there's always opportunity to do more where we can. And again, it comes down to where we're able to fund that. So there's been a lot, and we made a commitment, I think, through COVID. I'll double check this, but to continue cycle training where it is appropriate to do so. And we've seen a lot of community groups come together for cycling. So the Cycle Sisters, for example, is a really powerful example of, women coming together to cycle. So yes, there's always more to do, but I'm happy to share with councillors our cycling programme, and so that we can share that more widely.
Will be very good, Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, it is quite extensive, and so it covers free cycle training for adults as well as for children. We also have our all ability cycling, which is for people with disabilities, whether physical or learning disabilities, and they can come together and learn to cycle on adapted bicycles with their families. And then I think probably, Victoria's mentioned that there's Cycle Sisters, there's various bicycle clubs and groups within the borough that we're keen to support as well.
Councillor Bowring, please.
So you touched on cargo bikes, disability trikes, and the sort of larger bikes, and then we also had the question about sort of planning department. And I think a lot of the bike racks that get delivered through planning, through the planning department and planning committee, very often they are semi-vertical racks or two-tier racks where you can't park cargo bikes, which tradesmen use, parents use for transporting children. Is there any sort of steps going forward to sort of fine tune that with planning to sort of have some sort of provision for that as a sort of a policy that they would have for developers?
So I'm not super familiar with what the planning policies say about that. I would certainly be encouraging our officers to be pushing for different types of cycle provision when they're in discussions and negotiations with developers. But obviously, if we need something with more teeth, then we'll need to look at what's in the, what's already in the London plan and our own planning policies and whether they need updating.
And a quick submeasure. I think the challenge is when a space is such a premium for developer, the semi-vertical racks, the two-tier racks, they get, they're told you've got to do 200 spaces. They will do that in the smallest space possible. And for instance, like a Sheffield stand, which you could park a cargo bike against, if you've got 200 of those, it takes up more space. So I think that is the sort of inherent challenge. And I'm not saying all the spaces in a development should be suitable for cargo bikes, but perhaps there should be some inclusion if you need to have 5 or 10 or whatever. But
Thank you. Councillor Tuck, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question has been asked in parts by other councillors, but we now said like introduction of e-bikes and e-scooters, authorized one. Many London boroughs have already taken part in the, well, starting from the pilot, they've now introduced their own schemes. Why are we so late in coming to this? That's one thing. And another is cycling is not as popular in west part of the borough. You did say that we want to promote cycling, and we are doing few bits, but I want to know what more can we do to promote cycling in western part of the borough.
So just on your, sorry, Kez, so just on your point about e-bikes and e-scooters, so you're right, there is a Transport for London trial. I think when it first started around 2 years ago, there were still significant concerns around how that would be mobilised across London, and the decision at that time was not to participate in that trial. Obviously, that remained open for any of the London boroughs that chose not to participate, but that was one of the reasons. It was very early, and we wanted to understand what the impact of that pilot, because it is a pilot, would look like for all of the different boroughs that were participating. So accident rates, participation rates, how it affected active travel. So that was one of the reasons at the time that we chose not to participate as a borough.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was, just to answer Councillor Tuck's second question. I think there's definitely more that we can do. So we obviously have our programme of priority cycle routes, some of which are and new ones will be in the west of the borough. Obviously, Cycleway 9 is slowly making its way west. But that provision is only one side of it. And like Councillor Foote said earlier, there's areas that do have cycle lanes, but there's not necessarily people using them. And so I think storage is one of those issues, because if people feel that they don't have anywhere safe to keep their bike, they're less likely to have one. We know that that the e-bike schemes are very popular amongst younger people and people from minority ethnic backgrounds, so that's one of the things that we would hope would encourage take up of cycling as well. But I think it has to be a combination of all the measures, and a lot of it starts very young, and so making sure that all our schools are partaking in the STARS programme, are taking up the cycle training that's available to them is a good thing.
That's great. Thank you. And Councillor Bidoff, please.
Thank you. Picking up on e-bikes and e-scooters as well, you mentioned that people abandon e-bikes, and the words used were willy-nilly. What I've noticed, I haven't done any research, it's just noticing it from Twitter and other places like that, is that some councils that have taken up these trials have really tied down the providers to very tight contracts. And I read the other day that one of them has to move a bike within an hour if it's left in an objectionable way or in the wrong place. So all I'm asking is really, would we have as tight a contract as these new current providers seem to have? Because picking up on Councillor Tack's point about being late to the party, maybe we're late to the party because of the way mobikes went down so badly. Communications might have been part of that, but also it was just a very peculiar scheme. But I do think there are things that you can do to reassure the public that e-bikes are here, people like using them, but we're going to try and really clamp down on the dangers that they have or the risks that they pose. And I haven't finished the e-scooter point.
Okay, so on the bikes, yes, absolutely, that's what we'd want, and I think the advantage of setting up an agreement at this stage is that we can learn from those boroughs that have managed to get very tight agreements, and we're in contact with them. I mean, there is a move to at some point have a London-wide scheme with a single contract, but that's a few years away yet. So in the meantime, we would, if we were to bring this in, it would be on as tight a contract as possible.
And can I just finish the e-scooters point, Chair?
Very quickly, please.
Yes. The fear that they engender in other people, the speed with which e-scooter riders go down pavements, it's not good for the community. And I know an awful lot of people who are extremely angry at what we've got already, which is an unlicensed scheme. People using
Can we
them
please
illegally.
stick with cycling parking provision, please? Not digress to
No, I haven't. But
contracts.
it was brought up.
So
it was brought up
the
by
parking side, please.
It was brought up by
I do
the.
appreciate both the councillors, but please, can we just stick it with parking provision?
If I could just say, Sarah, yes, it was.
I don't think she should be allowed to answer if I'm not allowed to ask my question, Chair. I do think you need to
Was
get
it
this
on
right.
parking
Well, I was-
provision? for
No,
e-scooters?
and the answer isn't on parking provision. It's on e-scooters and the fear.
But
and-
we're talking about parking
we-
position,
Yes, so
Councillor Biddle.
then please
So all
don't
I'd
answer.
like to say is it was brought up in the context of cycle parking. Very happy to have a conversation with you, Joanna, and get your feedback and your thoughts on a potential e-scooter scheme.
I'm concerned about visually impaired people, older people, frail people who are very concerned about the accidents that might happen.
Thank you both. Okay, so yeah, I mean, personally, it's a good scheme. I think it's really good, encouraging for all the residents in Hounslow to take up some sort of cycling right across the borough. What I would say now is if we can just have a little bit of discussion as per normal routines with scrutineers. Anything that you want to ask or talk about, discuss? Yes, Councillor Tack.
Well, it was part of my question, a follow-up question in response that I've received. We're talking about few more cycling routes and west part of the borough. There are a few narrow bridges in western part of the boroughs. Baber Bridge, if I talk about specifics, would we be looking at widening these bridges as part of these improvements?
So I don't know specifically about that particular bridge, but I think one of the questions we'd need to ask ourselves is the value for money question about spending money, about widening potentially the complexity of something like a bridge. But I'll check that question with my team about where our plans are around cycleways and the network, and particularly in relation to bridge. But that would be my first thought, Councillor, but let me double check all of that information for you.
Thank you. Very quick. Councillor Bowring, please.
So this is just a sort of a question around the sort of cycle hangers. You sort of stated the figure, we've got 13 and 10 coming more, but that sort of figure of 23 is quite low. You sort of covered the demand-led process, but are we also considering it from a build it and they will come, because there are so many people who can't safely park the bikes and want to. My question is, why is that number sort of considerably low compared to sort of nearby similar boroughs, and what we're doing beyond just a demand-led thing to increase that?
So we are looking at whether we change how we do that rollout and move away from a demand-led scheme, but we obviously want to know that people will use it where they are put in. I mean, I think what's limiting us, cost, resources, time.
Thank you. Any more? Ever so quick, Councillor Biddle, please.
Thank you. There's been a lot of comment about delivery drivers using bikes and the need that they have. They have another need, and I just think that there is something that local authorities can club together to help with potentially. I'm saying that without any knowledge of how this would work. But in addition to the risks to their bikes when they're collecting a delivery, as it were, or delivering a delivery, being a possible risk of theft, and parking them overnight, whether they have parking or not, and quite often they don't. I've tried to get parking for a couple in my ward, but they are not able to get insurance for their bikes. They cannot get their bikes insured at all, not through the schemes, not through Deliveroo or Uber Eats or any of the companies for whom they work.
I don't think this is discussion for this committee for insurance.
Well, you need to encourage them to use bikes to do deliveries. That's the point.
Yes, I mean,
And local
insurance
authorities, if local authorities could club together to put pressure on the providers to provide some insurance, because if you're a low-paid worker and you're using your bike for work and your bike is stolen or damaged, there's nothing you can do but spend more money.
We'll take that up, I think, and discuss it with. I can discuss that with other boroughs.
It's a tragedy that they can't have the same privileges as anybody with a bike.
Thanks. Yeah, I wasn't aware of it, so thanks for raising it.
Thank you all. Okay, so we're going to wrap this one up and move on to the next agenda item. Councillor Dunn, Victoria, you're more than welcome to leave or stay if you want to. Councillor Shan, you're more than happy to sort of stay, leader. Yeah, no problem at all. But yes, we move on to the next item. Okay, brilliant. So this is one of our substantive items, the outcome of the SEND area inspection. We now move to the second of our substantial item tonight, the SEND area inspection that took place last year. Those who were on the committee last municipal year, remember that OSC considered SEND in March of last year. At that point, Ofsted judgment was embargoed. It has been since published, and as the report provided to us to make clear, the council, alongside some local strengths, also flagged areas of concern. Number one, a poor quality of EHC plans, including preparing children and young people for adulthood. Poor communication and lack of co-production with partners, including the workforce, parents, carers, young people, and other stakeholders. Weak commissioning arrangements for therapies, meaning that some children and young people do not get the help they need early enough. In addition, there were unacceptable waiting times for some therapeutic assessments and support, including SALT and OT. Weak quality assurance processes and value at the areas work to bring about improvements across education, health, and care. In the light of this, a written statement of action has been produced and was approved by the inspectors on the autumn, setting out how the council and our health partners will remedy these shortcomings. The first quarterly monitoring visit, assessing how we're delivering against the written statement of action, took place in January 2023. You will see from the committee papers that OSC has been asked to note the outcome of SEND area inspection that took place from the 28th of February to the 4th of March 2022, and the note of the written statement of action that was approved by Ofsted on the 13th of September 2022, and the quarterly monitoring arrangements. This is also an opportunity for OSC to understand what we are doing to ensure our SEND offer is appropriate and that we are on track to improve in those areas where we need improvement. We are joined this evening with Councillor Lily Bath, Cabinet Member for Children, Learning and Employment, and two officers, Steve Forbes, Executive Director of Children and Adult Services, and Anita Cornish, Assistant Director of Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. Welcome to you all. Thank you. May I ask you to introduce your report, please? You do have 5 minutes, Councillor Bath. No?
Thank you, Chair. I probably won't need 5 minutes, but I'll do a quick introduction. So, as you know, the council, like other local authorities, has a duty under the Children and Families Act to provide services for children with special educational needs and disabilities. It's not just providing services, but it's identifying those that have special educational needs and disabilities and making sure that our services meet their needs as best as possible. As you said in your introduction, there was a joint area inspection of the council last February, March, which was carried out by Ofsted and CQC, and it was to to assess how effective the council is in providing those services and how they are meeting the outcomes for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And as you said in the introduction, there were 4 areas that were identified as needing an improvement. Steve and Anita will go over. Sorry, did I say Anita? Yeah, I did. Yeah, Stephen and Anita. I thought I said Anita. Will go over the action plan that we will require to submit to Ofsted to show how we are going to meet how we're going to meet the areas of improvements that have been identified. And also, they'll go over in detail about the governance arrangements and how we monitor how well we are doing, and the different areas of projects that we have currently undergoing in terms of how we address the improvement. Just nationally, I want to say, I'm sure you all know this, but Hounslow has very similar challenges to other local authorities across the borough, across the area rather, in that we have a very high demand for our special educational needs services, and the demand outstrips the resources. So I think probably 2/3 of local authorities are overspending on their high needs budget, which means they are spending a lot more than they get in terms of meeting the demands in SEND provision. And we have been invited by other local authorities to take part in the safety valve programme, which we have taken part in and will be. And I think Stephen will give you some details around that. So I think I'm probably going to hand over to Stephen and Anita at this stage, and then we can take questions later. Thank you.
Councillor Bath and Chair. So not one to correct my lead member, but in this case I just have to add a little. The area review was a review of all providers in SEND, not just the council, because the SEND system is not under our control. So we have legal duties, but also do health and schools and education as well. So it was a complete review of everyone. It's not just the council's legal duties. On top of that, it's not a graded outcome, so it's not like other inspection regimes where you will get a inadequate, requires improvement, good or outstanding. Area reviews are not graded, they come out with a position statement. The requirement in terms of the written statement of action was to address only the 4 key areas they identified at the end of the letter. It was not to address any of the strengths and other weaknesses that are set out in the letter. So it, some respects, distorts our focus by just looking at the 4 big areas, but doesn't actually look at the things that we were good at, nor the other areas that we need to improve on as well. So those are picked up in other activities we're doing. So we established, in terms of governance, a work stream within the borough-based partnership with health. So that work stream is the children with disabilities, complex needs and SEND, and that includes children with mental health. So this feeds into that. And we also have set up, as you'll see in the written statement of action, a work stream within the One Hounslow programme. So that is the SEND and alternative provision work stream that looks at particular aspects for us in the council. And then the final bit, I can't give much information about the safety valve because we're currently still in the submission and sign-off process with DFE. That is a process to address high needs block deficits. So we currently have a cumulative deficit of about 12 million in the high needs block. That will be projected to grow to somewhere in the region of 76 million over 5 years if we don't do something different across the SEND system. So not just the council, but health partners and schools. But we can't actually tell you at the moment because the outcome of what we submitted and the sign off with DFE is under embargo. I would be hopeful we'll get to that point in the next month or so, but we just need to wait and see. And more than happy to come back and update you as to the way we've got to with the safety valve, because it will dovetail into many of these areas as well. So just happy to see that. And on that basis, I'll hand over to Anita, who will briefly probably just highlight some of the bits in the written statement of action that are worthy of note.
Good evening, colleagues and Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening. I do love to talk about SEND, because it's obviously something I'm very interested in, because you have to be. So the written statement of action, we recognise and accepted what was shared through the Ofsted and CQC inspection. And as Stephen said, it is a local area responsibility to deliver and make the improvements. And most importantly, our inspection really was based on our own self-evaluation. So we already knew that where we were, and it was considered that we did know ourselves, which I think is important in any inspection readiness. The key areas are areas that have been quite challenging for us. So we do have a written statement of action delivery group. We've got a tracker that's set up, and we have got work streams that are already progressing the 4 areas. I think one of the concerns that many of you as councillors would be aware of is some of the issues around speech and language therapy and occupational therapy, because whilst it is provided by health, it is a local authority duty to provide. But I think this last 6 months, we've really progressed working with an external agency to come and do a review and look at those commissioning arrangements and actually co-produce and work in a way to really understand what it is we want in terms of a therapy offer going forward. So I think there's been some really pleasing and necessary progress in that area. We've also done quite a lot of work around the quality assurance elements of education, health and care plans. We've got a SEND operational board that is meeting 6 weekly and is well represented and well attended by partners across the system. And this is where a lot of the operational activity is taking place, and we've already done audits. Those. I think some of the challenge around the quality of education health care plans is just the sheer demand. Hounslow is an outlier in terms of the number of EHCPs that we're responsible for. So that's been quite challenging. But we have got a really comprehensive training going on now to write those EHCPs in-house and actually improve that communication with parents and carers about the quality of those and the outcomes. If that's hopefully sufficient in terms of an overview.
No, thank you very much for the report. So just moving on to the questioning by me again. Here we go. So the first question is, and you kind of alluded to it already, so the 4 areas of improvements that the Ofsted report pointed out. What has been done so far from their training needs, development needs? How would residents see the difference?
So the first thing I need to say is that we will take probably 2 to 3 years to. SEND is like an oil tanker. It takes a long time to change, because what you're inherently trying to do, part of the area review was about our culture in Hounslow needs to change. So Anita will elaborate. We have a bit of a view that the only way to supporting children's needs is they have to go through an AHCP process. That is not true. It is not a route to money. It is not a route to resources. It's one route, but we have not had a methodology in Hounslow that looks at the other ways of doing it. We are an absolute outlier in the number of children that are sent to specialist provision. DFE have been quite direct with us on that, and we need to get to a point where more of our children are mainstreamed and educated in mainstream schools. So Anita can talk about our SEND centres we've got in schools there and the work we're doing there. But that's then about schools feeling competent, confident and capable of meeting children with higher support needs in mainstream education. And we know there are a couple of key points, particularly for adolescent boys in the second year at secondary, where mainstreaming seems to falter for them. So we need to tackle some of those areas as well. So there are big steps first that culturally within the system. One of the things we had to do was acknowledge we had to collectively own this improvement. Doesn't all come from me as the Director of Children's Services. A head teacher said to me last week, you can tell us what to do. And I said, if only that was the reality. I have very little directive power against what schools need to do. So there's cultural stuff needs to change about how we operate together. I think, in all honesty, it'll be at least to the end of this calendar year, if not into next year, when parents and children begin to see any significant improvements, because some of these changes are substantial.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. Councillor Kiani, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is that how has support for SEND children changed or improved as a consequence of inspection report?
I think I would just repeat what I've said to the chair in terms of, however, Anita might be able to pinpoint one or two small examples where we have made some.
I think what we should remember, and it was highlighted in the outcome letter, is how well children's education is in Hounslow. So children do well at school, and children with special educational needs also do well. And a lot of our schools are, are outstanding or good. So I think it's that's a very important element of here. And I do feel that we're certainly feeling a lot more collaborative, and we've really taken to heart that thing about co-production, and we're seeing some positive change, but we are going to take some time to really see, because it's only the experience that's going to let us know that things are better, and I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Anita has said. I mean, I haven't had this portfolio for long, but what we did do very early on, I think a few months ago, is that we did actually meet with schools to discuss the SEND, our improvement plans and what we're going to do going forward. And I think that felt very collaborative, I think. And I think it's the beginning. I think there's obviously a lot more to do, because we want to work with schools to make sure that they help children at an early stage, rather than them getting to the stage where they need an education and health. Obviously, we recognise that many children will need an education and healthcare plan. But what Stephen is saying is that if we can try and work with schools early on to support them, so that they know they can put the right support in place when it's needed, rather than thinking that the only support they're ever going to get is through an education healthcare plan. So I think our discussions and our collaboration and our first conference that we had, I thought was positive, but I think there'll be more discussions and collaborative work to be had. It's only the beginning, really.
Councillor Bowring, please.
Can I firstly applaud that cultural shift away from a higher amount of segregation to integration into the general student population? I think that's brilliant. My question is, do we recognise that certain segments of the population are more adept at driving forward assessments and procuring the correct support for their children within kind of perhaps cultural and class demographics? And that particularly when resources are being stretched, what steps are being taken to ensure that children from vulnerable backgrounds or families who lack the social and cultural capital to push forward an SEN assessment or procure the correct support are given access to the right support? In essence, how do we make sure that those with the greatest need are prioritised, not those who shout the loudest or form fill the most skillfully?
It's a good question, because so I would say the most vulnerable children in the SEND population are those that we care for. So we have a significant proportion of our children who are looked after by the local authority, have education, health and care plans, quite a substantial number. So they have us as the corporate parent to, in essence, advocate as well as be the system that meets their needs. We then have the children who have got allocated social workers who are not looked after, but maybe child protection plan or child in need status. And the virtual school was given an additional role by central government in the last year for our virtual school head to have oversight of all the strategic activity around about children on child protection plans and children in need. And a substantial number of those also have EHCP and SEND requirements. So we've got that strategic look at it from the virtual college, looking at what it can do. I think for the children within the special schools, we've just agreed potentially in this financial year coming a £2.5 million investment into the special schools out of the high needs block, which we will have to find from somewhere else in the high needs block because it doesn't grow at that level. So that's nearly an 8.7% increase on their funding to meet those children's needs. I think to go back to, I think thankfully don't have a culture in Hounslow where the most vocal get the resource. I've been elsewhere where there have been very vocal groups who seem to set the pace for everybody else and send. It's not something that we have. What we do need to do is we need to work a bit closer with the Parent Carer Forum to make them the voice of all parents, because that's a group that has struggled a wee bit in terms of capacity in our engagement with them. So we're doing some work with them at the present time. But unless Anita corrects me, we don't have a culture of the loudest getting first.
I think the system, it does allow for that, for parents who are more articulate and able to advocate. But I do feel quite strongly, and it was referenced in the outcome letter, that we do have a very strong SEND-IS, which is the which we as a local authority do have to ensure is in place, which is an independent advice service. We also do have colleagues in the west of the borough who actually attended our SEND summit, and actually parents there have really had opportunities to develop their skills and work with other parents, which is really great. And I think the thing about the written statement of action that's quite exciting opportunity is how do we help other parents help each other to understand from their different perspectives, because I think language SEND system is very complex, it's very difficult to understand, even for us who's sitting here, the language, the use of terminology. So I'm quite excited that we could look at ways to really help parents actually navigate the whole system, not just the EHC, but actually knowing what they should be expecting for their child if they're in nursery or at school, because everybody has a responsibility around identifying and meeting needs and making provision for children with additional needs.
Councillor Sharma, please.
Chair, thank you, Chair. So going back to what I said earlier on the wrong place. So what are we doing to support those 10 children from year 11 onwards, or specifically for some children that may not be showing special educational needs because they could be like high achievers and it's masked. You know, what are we doing to be able to support them?
So that's not a surprise question because you alluded to it earlier on. It's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, the SEND area review did highlight that our preparation for adulthood, and it's part of the SEND system about thinking what happens next. And you should be thinking probably, I think we would say at about age 14, what's happening for someone. Because I think one of my frustrations is we spend an awful lot of time in the SEND system talking about schooling in the here and now. And actually schooling is just a short part of people's lives. My biggest concern, if we can get that right, is for lots of our youngsters coming out of the SEND system, what the future holds for them. And particularly the cohort we've got that's growing are those children, the broad category of social, emotional and mental health needs. And they are a growing category for us. And what happens to them is not at the moment, I think, in not just Hounslow, but across our society as a whole, a very good destination point. So one of the things we need to get better, which is absolutely how do we plan for what's happening in adulthood? What is the next step into third level education, vocational training and job and experience? And we have a fair bit of work, I think, to do with college level provision and vocational level provision and planning in schools for what happens next. And I'm quite committed. If there's anything I would like to, I'm going to say leave Hounslow. That does not suggest that I'm leaving Hounslow. Anything I'd like to look back at my time in Hounslow is we got the routes into work sorted for most of our children coming out of SEN. So we've been doing a fair bit of work with the EY Foundation. We have Project Search And actually, I was here last night for the September intake for Project Search of parents and young people who are interested in work. We had 45 people in the room, which was really positive. But we need to step up and say, well, actually, for those that can go to work, how do we start planning at 14 for that? For those that don't, they have the safety net of transitioning into adult social care if they meet the threshold. But for that group who could work and just doesn't quite work for them, and since COVID, the work market has got much tougher. So for that cohort of youngsters, we've got to do a little bit more. So hopefully in the Youth Skills Guarantee, some of the targeted work will be looking at the SEN cohort as well.
Thank you. Councillor Bath.
I'm going to repeat what Stephen said. I'm absolutely committed to making sure that we do as much as we can in terms of improving the pathways and opportunities for children and young people with SEND. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think some of you were at the workshop last week where we were looking at the youth guarantee, and I think some of the statistics around young people not in employment and on universal credit for a long time were quite startling, actually, and some of that has come out of the pandemic. So those cohort are not showing any recovery. So I think there is a lot of work to do. And I hope, I was here when we did Project Search last time to give out some the awards, and it was really fantastic to see some really good outcomes for some of our young people who really would struggle without that support. So I think that is something we absolutely have to put 100% in, and we will, and hopefully the youth guarantee will help us in that area as well.
Yep.
A statistic I do have to hand, because it was for last night, is nationally 4.8% of people with a learning disability autistic spectrum are in work. That's shameful for our society as a whole. For those that go through our Project Search offer, which is a full year in supported internship in the council and partners, 67% of those youngsters secure full-time employment.
That is
it
great.
works.
That's
That's why we want to extend it, because there are more youngsters out there who could make use of it.
That's brilliant. Councillor Kamran, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is in terms of our council, Hounslow performance, like how is our performance as compared to the neighboring boroughs? Like in Healing and Hillingdon, in terms of SEND.
Any specific, because there's a whole load of performance indicators about SEND, so any particular bit that you're interested in?
No, it's just a journal, like our services and SEND services and the neighboring borough. Is it good, bad, like how?
Some our other, like Ealing and Hammersmith and Fulham, don't have a written statement of action, but what we do know, we work very closely as a West London alliance, actually, and we do share good practice. We do know that Ealing, as a statistical neighbour as well, has very similar challenges around demand for provision, and also the demand for specialist provision. But if there's any specific things, we can always come back or bring you information to another point.
I think, Chair, what I would say is to reflect on something Anita said. Whilst the area review said there are things we need to do to improve, and we had identified them ourselves and we're working on them, actually what Anita said at the start is, what we do know, if you look at progression and attainment data for children in school with special educational needs, our children in Hounslow do well. They do at national average or above. So the bit for me is, if we actually improve some of the processes, we might actually even get better. So it's not that the system is failing their educational needs. There's bits of the system are failing to deliver things on time, in the right level, in the best way of planning it and assessing it, and the timeliness of that. But even then, through all of that, our children still attain at national level or above in progression in educational achievement for their cohort. So for me, the opportunity is we could step them up even further if we get all the system change stuff done well.
No, that's promising. So if I can have Councillor Biddulph, please.
Thank you. Picking up a point that Councillor Bowring raised about advocacy, but this is a different form of advocacy. Do you know if anybody's slipping through the net because of not a failure to be able to fight for their child, but perhaps a language barrier? Are we sure that we're supporting everybody across our community who needs to be supported?
So what I would say to that is there are no doubt people who are struggling, might slip through the net and might not get timely response. So to go back to the conference we had, the parent forum that Reach Foundation have, who came to that conference, the one thing that stuck with me that day was one of the parents standing up there and saying, it was 4.5 years ago that my son got his diagnosis of autism, and 4 years on, I didn't know where to go. And I sat listening to that rattle around my head for the rest of the morning going, that's the problem. So whoever delivered the diagnosis didn't know, didn't see it as a priority to then make the links. And our system, as Anita says, is fractured in places. So it's how we make that information flow. So we've got a good SENDIAS system, but unless you know about it, you can't get access to it. So did the person who gave the diagnosis, which we have long waiting times for autistic spectrum diagnosis, potentially get the information to that person in obvious time? They didn't, because 4 years later, she still didn't know where to go for her son. And we see it for preparing for adulthood, because parents get really worried about what's happening to their adult youngster child coming up to 18 and 25. So there's a whole bit of trying to get that information flow working better for people.
And this was just to at that point. So this is part of course the steps from Ofsted. So we are going to be improving that communication and that streaming process in the coming years, which is great news. Can I just have Councillor Kiani, please?
Thank you, Chair. I think, Stephen, you just answered partially for my following question, but I will ask anyway. What support is in place for parents and families?
There's quite a wide question there.
It is,
yeah.
Means what's like, you just said, the parents said, I'm still waiting in 4 years' time. So we do not have enough publication or material to give them or publicize it. That's
So we have to have a local offer, which is a very challenging concept, because no matter what we've done to advertise it with bus stop campaigns, people still don't know what it is. But it is really we've actually got, as it's in the written statement of action, and actually it's an opportunity, I think, to really try and get that information out to people, and actually probably have families and more involved in trying to put things in wordings, have more clips and videos and things like that. So there is somebody who's working with me who's going to do quite a comprehensive review, because it should be really the go-to place, as well as events. And our Parent Carer Forum do an annual event which is really well attended, where they try to bring together different agencies, but the local offer is the thing that we really need to have in place. It's quite good, but I think again it's that thing, do people know what it's there for? Can they access it? Do they understand what it is? So it's a really important part of what we're doing, which we could do quite well quite quickly.
Just to add, I think the challenge is the SEND system and the diversity of the needs of the children and families in it are so wide. It's almost impossible for me, I think, to envisage a single solution to this. So if you're getting a diagnosis or you're getting an assessment, how do you get to the information? Who helps you do that? It varies dependent whether or not your child's in a special school, where you might get some additional support to understand things, as opposed to in a mainstream school where it'll be the SENCO who probably is the person who's got knowledge. If you're getting a diagnosis from a clinician, are they seeing beyond the diagnosis to think about your anxiety needs and your information needs and your planning needs for your child going forward? It's immense. And our offer, because we have to have it, is the local offer, which is a source of information. And the SENDIAS offer then complements that, and having people who you can have a conversation with. And the Parent Carer Forum should supplement that, because that's a peer support mechanism. And the professionals in schools should supplement that. If you tie all that together, making that work efficiently is one of the key challenges in improving the information flow. Because I've been elsewhere where one of the outcomes of the area review is no one knows about the local offer. And you can say it's on the website. The Sendias can point people to it. How, beyond bus stops, newspaper adverts, how do we get that information out? Why are Senkos or teachers in special schools not signposting people to that? That was one of my challenges elsewhere. Why is that not happening? No matter how good the information is available on the local offer, if people don't know it's there and don't signpost, the information is meaningless. And that's a challenge we've got to get over here about how do you make the information accessible and people know where to get it. Any answers thankfully received in terms of helping us get there, because it's really complex. And then if you bring in English as a second language and people from other minority communities who don't understand what the system's about in the school, it just becomes even more complex as a nut to crack in getting it right.
Councillor Bath.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that. I think that's a really important question. And I'm thinking about other areas and other local authorities where perhaps some parents are a bit more kind of coordinated. There's more parent sort of support groups, etc., and they're more coordinated and perhaps they are more vocal. I think there is quite, as a parent myself, I've been through, situations where I've needed to get advice and support for my children. And I think there is a lot of information there, but it's always a challenge to coordinate it and have it in one place, isn't it? I mean, I think, we talked about the local offer before, and I think it can be improved. And I think that's something we absolutely need to do. But going back to Councillor Biddulph's sort of point earlier on about perhaps somebody with English not their first language falling through the system, I think, you would expect school to sort of be able to pick that up first. We do have a really good SendDS service. I've actually used it myself and I thought it was fantastic, really, really good. But I do think it's how connected you are with your community and parent support groups, how you get that information. And if you are, if you are a parent that's able to do the research and know what to do and where to get, you'll probably find everything. And you'll probably find a lot of support and legal support, particularly out there, to help you to navigate the system, because it exists, isn't it? Because the system allows that to exist. So if you want support at a tribunal, etc., you'll find it there. It is there. But you are right, it's about making sure those that perhaps haven't got the means of getting that support we're still able to support the most vulnerable. I think that is sometimes going to be a challenge, but yeah, I think that's probably a challenge everywhere, really.
Thank you, Councillor Bath. Councillor Bowring, please.
Recently, a governor from the Green School for Girls contacted me about challenges in recruitment, and Stephen, you'll know because I wrote to you about it. Thank you for your response. So she talked about the disparity in pay scales with Ealing. She talked about the cost of housing in the boroughs of key constraints. So my question is, do we think those sorts of things affect getting in SEND staff? And is attracting SEND staff more of a challenge to general staff, or do you have any kind of wider thoughts or comments on that?
So Anita and I would agree that recruitment is a constant challenge, including for our internal services. So, for example, the service that I always ask Helen, who's our lead educational psychologist, is how is the team? We've gone from that team being down to 50% of capacity, and educational psychologists are absolutely critical and key in the education, health and care planning system. We can't technically sign off an EHCP without an educational psychologist having line of sight of it. And we struggle desperately to maintain that service because there is just a national shortage of educational psychologists, national shortage of speech and language and occupational therapists. So at the moment, I sit on the North West London People Board with NHS colleagues. Last week, we were having a conversation about what's the common group of staff that we all have a problem with. It was occupational therapists. We currently have over 150 odd vacancies across North West London for occupational therapists. And we have a constant problem about children being allocated occupational therapy as part of their education healthcare plan, and the providers not being able to supply that because they can't recruit the staff. Likewise, schools have a problem with teaching assistants and being able to recruit people to become teaching assistants to support children. And they also have a problem with getting the right caliber of SENCOs as well. So I don't think there's a part of the SEN system like, and it's my constant one. I think you'll all probably get fed up with me saying that my constant concern across the health and social care system, whether it be children's and adults, is the workforce issue. I just have to go to, in this year, Skills for Care, which is our national adult workforce monitor, identified that we lost 7,500 social workers out of the social care workforce, and we lost 50,000 people out of the wider social care workforce. And we have countless jobs across the SEN system in schools and the NHS and our own services that are vacant. And I do have to be critical that central government has not come out with a plan at a national level to address these issues. I get very frustrated about it. It's hard not to get frustrated about it. The current solution, coming out with independent review of children's social care, are 500 social work apprenticeships nationally. I have 100 social work vacancies. So I could take a fifth of those straight off. We could use 500 in North West London alone. And that's the same for speech and language therapists who are even rarer than OTs. But we could solve it if government got behind a national apprenticeship programme for the health and social care sector, because that takes resourcing. Because the problem for us is we can do that, but you need the practice teachers and the mentors and the support officers behind the apprentice to make it work. And we've expanded our apprenticeship programme in adults and children's this year, and we struggle to find the practice teachers to support the 10 additional apprentices that we put in place. So the vicious circle could become a virtuous circle if we could find a national solution out of it. It cannot be left to individual areas to address it. It has to be led nationally. I'll come off my soapbox now because I'm going to hear myself getting more and more frustrated by it.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Tack, please.
I'm coming back to how we let the parents know about the support, what is available. When the parents find out about their kids that they need special education needs, it's a devastating thought for the parents, but it will be a good idea to provide them the information at the same time when they find out that yes, there is a problem, but what support is available. If they find the information at the same point, they can access the services in a lot better way or quickly. So if we can do something to provide the information through the practitioner who's diagnosing, that will be, in my opinion, a great way to provide the information.
Councillor Biddle, please.
Thank you. Thinking about the review that you're going to be going through, that you're going to be looking at, is going to be slow to implement. Going to ask the same question that as I asked earlier about the pandemic, is will you be asking recent former SEND teachers to feed into that? Would that help inform your discussions? I know one as it happens. I went to school with somebody who was one of our SEND teachers but has recently retired. It might be that they have things to say with greater freedom, not concerned about their career progression. They might speak more freely about what they think needs to be done. Are you factoring people like that into your research, as it were, or review?
Yeah. So as Anita said, we've upscaled on the co-production, talking to staff, professionals, families, you name it. I'm not opposed to whenever we run a co-production event, if people have got something to say and have got something to contribute, I really don't care who they are, as long as it's a purposeful contribution to helping us. So what we have to get to now is to stop observing the problem and start collectively to come up with discussions about solutions. So we've spent a bit of time in Hounslow observing the problem. We now need to start getting to a solution. So if there's anybody who has a solution, we'll look at it, because we are certainly not the singular point of all the solutions to how this system needs to improve. So we've set it out in an action plan, but that's only addressing the 4 areas. There are lots of other things that are not in there that need to shift to improve. So happy if anybody wants to put themselves forward to be engaged in that process. There's always an opportunity coming up in terms of a co-production event, a consultation event, a conference or whatever for people to get involved.
I think I'm just going slightly further than that. And will you be inviting them? You know, it's a former teacher in the borough, recently retired. It's a question of asking them if they've got some suggestions for solutions. That's what I mean.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Thank you, Councillor Bath, Stephen, Anita. So we are going to actually move now to the discussion stage. So it's now time to discuss the reports and what we've heard. May I remind you that everyone who wishes to speak have a chance to do so, but may also ask you to focus your comments on the recommendations asked on page 53 of the report. Is there anything that anybody wants to discuss ever so quickly?
Thank you.
Yep, Councillor Sharma.
Thank you. I would just like to say, and to give praise to the children for working so hard to get their grades up to the standard that they have, even with this label. I hope that we get to a point where the label does not define them. And that's my point, really. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Bidoff.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I haven't got the recommendations in front of me. I just wanted to pick up on one point, though, which was I'm really pleased to hear the words culture change, and that's the focus of your work, because that is what I've been frustrated by, is a certain, I've raised it in another context the other day, is a certain defensiveness. I'm thinking about EHCPs. When there was a phase I was getting parents asking me, they still haven't settled my EHCP. I was going and saying, it's constantly in flux, it's changing again. At some point, there has to be a baseline from which you start. And if that's part of the culture shift, it'll be really good news for parents who are struggling to help their children progress. So thank you.
Any other discussions? Yeah, Councillor Bowring.
Yeah, I think just more of a general comment. I think from what we've read prior to this meeting, what we've heard tonight, it is apparent that this is both a mammoth and a hugely important subject. So I would just like to note whether Paul, if you're with Scrutiny in the next year, that's something future Scrutiny committees might want to look into further.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, certainly. I mean, you just heard it from Stephen that this is going to take quite a while. So I'm pretty sure that future chairs will certainly look into this. But anything else? Is that it? Brilliant. Okay. So I'm just going to ask Councillor Foote to propose the motion in response to the recommendations, please.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've got the the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is asked to note the outcome of the SEND area inspection that took place on the 28th of February to the 4th of March. Note the written statement of action that was approved by Ofsted on the 13th of September 2022 and the quarterly monitoring arrangements. I move that, Chair.
Yep, thank you for that. That's all been approved. That's brilliant. Okay, well, that's all done. Thank you all for being here, Councillor Bath and Stephen and Anita. So thank you so much for that. Again, Councillor Rajwat, if you want to stay, you're more than welcome to. But this is totally up to you. But that is that item all done. Moving on to item number 6, updates from Scrutiny Panel. OSC will now have 3 scrutiny panels working across the year. All 3 panels have met at least 3 times the Housing Environment panel only yesterday, and I would like to ask each panel chair to provide a short update on their work thus far. If I can, so Councillor Sharma is also the council representative of North West London Joint Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I understand that the committee will meet next, is it tomorrow? So we look forward to the update in April for that. Yes, if I can just ask the other chairs for the update. Councillor Kayani.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, you rightly mentioned that we met 3 times. One was 17th of October, 12th of December, and yesterday, 6th of March. By way of reminder, the panel's membership compromises, I'll just say who are the members. Yeah, Councillor Asim, Councillor Bowring, Vice Chair of this committee, this panel, sorry, Councillor Emsley, Councillor Foot, Councillor Perisotto, Councillor Sharma, Councillor Siddiqui, and Councillor Omer. OSCE has already seen the panel's terms of reference. In summary, a focus on the tenant and leaseholders' experience of the satisfaction with repairs. The main areas of investigations are operating context, performance and process, both within the council and Kualo, customer services, customer journeys, and customer satisfaction, and Kualo's customer base, capacity and capability. The panel invited a range of guests from LBH housing functions, from the council's customer services department, and a number of senior member of the Kualo and Lambton 360 organization to our December meeting. We were keen to understand 3 key aspects of the issue: the relationship between the council and Kualo, how customer concerns were raised, allocated, and resolved, and how performance across the range of areas of Kualo work and understood and reported. Whilst we saw a wide range of performances metrics in December, the panel continued to question if these are the right performance data is, and if not, how can this be used to ensure that those metrics the council and Kualo use are best able to inform future activity. Based on what we learned, we are homing in 5 recommendations which will focus on performance in terms of commissioning for the council and operational performance for Kualo, alongside practical applications of how this performance can be used to focus on voids and wider customer satisfaction. The panel recognizes its role isn't to create a new system, but it hopes its recommendation will be useful to both the council and Kualo. Our final meeting is scheduled for 24th of April, but it may change to 18th of April. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. And Councillor Sharma for the Health and Adult Care Scrutiny Panel, please.
Thank you, Chair. At the Wednesday, the 22nd of February meeting of the Health and Adult Care Scrutiny, panel members received 3 presentations. The presentations focused on dementia services and pathways, case studies of good practice of dementia care in the community, and dementia engagements. The panel members were presented with a video recording from co-optee Barbara Bendeck about her experiences as a carer for someone with dementia. The panel was keen to understand a bit more about the pathway from diagnosis to care support, and Kim Steady, the ASC Strategic Oversight and Development Lead, presented her findings. The Enhanced Dementia Care Services was established to assist residents with dementia presenting at A&E with targeted interventions. The service recently received an additional 0.5 million increase to expand the services, and since the implementation, there has been a 7.5% and 12% decrease in people with dementia presenting at A&E. GP Salotra, a West London Trust GP, informed panel members of the Cognitive Impairment and Dementia Services, SIDS. SIDS is a multidisciplinary service involved in the initial assessment of dementia into pathway to care. However, the service is struggling to meet the targets for diagnosis due to staffing shortages. The panel was reassured a plan was in place to improve staff retention. The service has identified more work is needed to improve outreach to ethnic minority groups and partnership work between care pathways. The panel were informed of any upcoming engagement opportunities with Age UK Hounslow, meetings with palliative care practitioners and social workers. On Monday, the 27th of February, the panel members visited Age UK. Panel members discussed the services and activities available to residents with Beverly Fife, CEO of Age UK Hounslow, and Mac Downs, chair member of Age UK Hounslow. In the meeting, the panel will look at the evidence and discuss the findings and recommendations of the next view. That's in the next meeting. And then for JOSC, as you said, we have a meeting tomorrow being held at Ealing. So there has been no meetings, but agenda has been published for tomorrow's meeting. And the points to be discussed is a summary of consultation and proposal of elective orthopaedic centre, and the 5 key themes are to be discussed: travel, site location, clinical model and patient experience, workforce model, and staff experience and equity. The panel members will also be presented with the North West London Integrated Care System update report, and panel members will be presented with 3 reports on inpatient mental health bed capacity across North West London JOST recommendations and information request tracker, and Scrutiny Committee work programme update. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So if any member does wish to know Chair Councillor Prezzotto, I'm sure you can sort of get in contact with her via email and sort of request that information. I'd like to thank everybody for today. For those updates, we are sort of going to move on to the agenda item number 7, which is the work programme. So we developed a work programme in July and agreed at our summer meeting we must keep the document under review, and based on discussions at the last OSC, members will note that we now have an item looking at housing associations scheduled for our May meeting. So any are there areas in the committee that think now worthy of inclusion that weren't captured when we agreed the programme last year? We must remember though that our time as a committee is finite, so if we add new items we need to consider what might need to be removed. No? Okay. To end, members will know that we've been asked to consider the Staveley Road and Burlington Lane experimental schemes, final review, when we meet in April. This will be an opportunity to provide pre-decision scrutiny and let Cabinet have our views on an issue that has generated not inconsiderable public interest during its consultation process. To allow the committee to consider the item properly, I have taken the decision that we will need to postpone our consideration of primary care, originally scheduled for April. I doubt if we'll be able to add it to our May agenda, so I'll suggest that this is considered by OSC in the 2023-24 municipal year. That is it. Any discussions with that? Yeah.
Thank you. I agree with postponing an item so that we can get this done. I don't know what a pre-decision scrutiny process is. This isn't something that I've experienced before. Normally there's a call-in of a decision. So what is this and how does it work?
Can I pass that to... Yeah, please, Rachel. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bidoff. So you're right. So there is that process, which is the call-in that we're all familiar with. But there's also another process where cabinet members can send a decision for pre-scrutiny before it goes to cabinet, where it's controversial or they just think that there's a public interest in doing this. So I mean, since I've been here, we haven't done it, but it can be done, and this is an example of that. So that's probably why it's a bit unfamiliar, because it's not something that's done often, well, since I've been here. But yeah.
And so what is the process? Do we take evidence do we call people to come and speak to us? What actually happens? I really don't know how it works. I know how a call-in works.
Yeah, so I think I don't know if Paul, if you can jump in on the actual procedure on the day for it. Yeah, that'd be helpful.
So as per any other meeting of OSC, the committee will receive a report, and that in this particular case, that report would also address issues contained within that chief officer's decision. We haven't seen that report yet. You'll get that toward the end of March, and it'll set out what the committee is asked to do. That then gives the committee a chance to comment on whatever proposal comes before it, which then gives the committee a chance to influence Cabinet and report back to Cabinet on what OSC considers with regard to the Staveley Road Burlington issue. So it's not like a call-in because there's no decision to call in. Instead, this is a proposal. What does the committee think of it?
but just based on having a report from an officer, not based on having anybody who's got experience of or opinions on the scheme, but it's just a report, is it? Because I think normally we would want to have a range of opinions, and tonight we've had people presenting to us across a subject. This is just going to be a paper report and the officer presenting it with no input from residents or others?
No, we'd expect the lead member, as we have tonight, to have the lead member and then officer support as necessary. I think with regard to the particular decision coming to the committee in April, there's been a lot of consultation already. So those kind of questions are questions you want to pose to Councillor Dunn or to Victoria or to Jefferson. What has come from that, rather than bring more people in for more consultation.
Okay, thanks. I think an awful lot of people need a pre-briefing then, because just to have it on paper, some of us have experienced it and experienced representations, but others will have no knowledge of what's actually been happening locally.
No, I mean, not to jump in on Paul's toes, but yes, absolutely. We'll need to do some briefing and like a paper to just explain the process, because it's
So I'm moving on from the process. I understand that it's more
but for
briefing,
all members
for being
as well.
briefed by people who have experience of this scheme, not just officers who want to implement it. That's what I mean. Who's going to come and talk to us about the reasons why it's being scrutinised?
Well, that will be the officers and the exec member.
But that's a very one-sided view, isn't it? It's not representing the situation, it's representing the policy.
But I think because it isn't the call-in in the traditional sense, where members have called it in and then there will be the presentation from members talking about it in that respect. So it's slightly different. So
Chair,
that's my understanding of it anyway.
As I understood it, that Councillor Dunn is sort of self-referring herself to scrutiny, saying this is a decision that's coming forward. She's sort of putting it before scrutiny to see if we've got any input or any questions. Would that be a fair representation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly as we do at the moment with anything else. We'll do the same thing. So we put it. Yeah, Councillor Tuck.
A question regarding the process, the report comes to OSC, we send it back to cabinet with few recommendation, a decision is taken. Can that decision later be called in by the members?
Sorry. So because you're undertaking pre-decision scrutiny, once you've fed your thoughts back to cabinet and cabinet make a decision, then a decision could be called in. The constitution sets out the requirements that would need to be fulfilled for a call into work. But yes, going through pre-decision scrutiny would not preclude something being called in. You would simply need to make sure that the reasons for call-in were valid reasons for call-in. And the constitution sets out Rachel's role as well.
I suppose it's like that stage is still there. But what would be helpful for members for the committee is if I kind of set out what that is, even though it is documented, but if I put it in a little summary note or something, just to aid clarity on the steps and kind of what that means, i.e. that question that you've just raised there.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. So Rachel will take it away and hopefully email all the committee members with what the whole process is and sort of going forward from that as well. I think that's fair to say. Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, so just going through the last sort of agenda items. So any urgent business, any urgent sort of matters? No, the date of the next meeting is coming up on my screen at 11th of April 2023. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you. Thanks.